My name is Madeline Pierce. I was 34 when my husband finally told me I needed to stop controlling his life. And the strange part was that he said it while still expecting me to keep his life running smoothly. I worked as an operations manager for a restaurant equipment distributor outside Denver, which meant I spent most of my days solving problems before they became expensive. Somewhere along the way, I started doing the same thing at home. My husband, Colin Barrett, was 33 and produced corporate events and brand launches. When we first got married, he used to say we worked because we were different. He brought energy into a room, and I made sure there was still a room standing when everyone went home. For years, I thought that balance meant we understood each other. We bought our house 6 years into our relationship, and I put most of the down payment together from savings I had built before the wedding. Colin loved that house when we moved in. He called it proof that we were building something real, and he used to tell friends he could take chances with work because I always kept home steady. At the time, I heard that as appreciation. Then, steady slowly became predictable. Colin started asking why every weekend needed a plan and why every bill had to be paid early. He joked that living with me sometimes felt like living inside a calendar. I laughed at first because I thought couples were allowed to tease each other about the things they once loved. Around that time, Sabrina Doyle started appearing more often in Colin's stories from work. She was a freelance stylist who worked several of his events, and at first there was nothing unusual about hearing her name. Then work drinks stretched later. Messages started arriving during dinner, and Colin began turning his phone over whenever he left it on the table. Every concern I raised somehow became proof that I was making his life too serious. One Friday, Colin's parents, Douglas and Patricia, came over for dinner. Halfway through the meal, Colin checked a message, pushed back his chair, and said he had to handle a client problem. I asked if Sabrina would be there, and his expression hardened immediately. "Why does everything with you have to become an interrogation?" he said. Then he picked up his coat and walked out while his parents were still sitting at our table. After Colin walked out, I tried to keep dinner moving because I did not know what to do. Patricia pushed food around her plate while Douglas sat stiffly beside her, angry but quiet. I told them Colin probably had a client problem, even though I no longer believed it. An hour later, Patricia said she did not want to stay in our house, so I offered to drive them to their hotel. Wet snow had started falling by the time I left. The roads were slick, and headlights blurred across the windshield as I drove home alone. Near an entrance ramp, a car ahead fishtailed, forcing me to swerve hard. I hit the divider hard enough for the airbag to explode against my face, and for several seconds I could not understand why everything had gone silent. My left wrist hurt when I tried to move it, and pain ran through my shoulder whenever I breathed deeply. A paramedic asked who they should contact, and I reached for my phone before he finished asking. I called Colin once, then again, but both calls went unanswered. Inside the ambulance, I sent one message saying I had been in an accident and was going to the hospital, then watched until the word "read" appeared beneath it. He still did not call. Douglas and Patricia reached the emergency room before the doctor finished checking me, and Patricia looked close to tears when she saw my wrist. Douglas asked where Colin was, and I had to tell him I did not know. I kept looking at my phone because some part of me believed my husband would walk through the hospital doors for me that night. Almost 3 hours after the crash, Colin finally called. He said he had been handling an event problem and kept his phone on silent, but I asked how he had read my message if he had never checked it. He went quiet, and that silence told me more than his explanation did. Then I asked the question I had avoided all night. "Were you with Sabrina?" There was another pause before Colin answered. He did not say yes, and he did not say no. Instead, he asked, "Is this really what you want to talk about right now?" I looked at Patricia beside my hospital bed and understood the answer mattered less than what he had already done. I came home with my wrist in a brace and my shoulder sore enough that getting dressed took twice as long as usual. For the first 2 days, Colin brought me coffee, reheated meals, and asked whether I needed anything before he left the room. It almost felt like the man I had married had returned. Then, on the third evening, he put on a jacket and told me he needed to get out for a while. I asked where he was going, and his face tightened before I finished the question. He said the house had become suffocating and accused me of using the accident to make him feel guilty. I reminded him that I had never asked him to cancel work or stay beside me every minute. I had only expected my husband to act like my husband while I recovered. After that, I stopped asking where he went. I stopped checking the clock when he came home late, and I stopped trying to turn every strange detail into an explanation I could live with. A few days later, Grant Ellison caught me outside while I was struggling to carry a small package inside with one hand. He helped me with it, then casually mentioned the crowd at our house the previous weekend. I stared at him because Colin had told me 2 coworkers had stopped by to pick up equipment. Grant looked confused and said there had been closer to 10 people coming and going. He had assumed Colin was hosting something for work while I stayed with Patricia to recover. I thanked him, without explaining that Colin had never mentioned a gathering. Inside, I started noticing things I had overlooked before. There was a cocktail glass in the dishwasher that did not belong to us, a woman's jacket hanging inside the guest closet, and a delivery receipt for enough food to feed 12 people. When Colin came home, I asked him about the gathering. He shrugged and said I was making something out of nothing again. Normally, I would have kept asking questions until his story made sense. That night, I simply said, "Okay." Colin stared at me as if my calm bothered him more than an argument would have. For the first time, I realized I did not need to prove that he was lying before I could decide what his behavior meant. After he went upstairs, I opened the small safe where we kept our household documents. I pulled out insurance papers, loan agreements, recurring bills, and the records connected to Colin's side venture. My name appeared more often than I remembered, sitting there with one usable hand. I finally stopped asking whether Colin still loved me and started asking a different question. How much of his life was I still holding together? The papers in front of me told a story I had never read as a whole. Colin's equipment lease for his side venture had my name attached as guarantor, and a small credit line depended on our household income. I had agreed to those things willingly because that was what marriage meant to me. If Colin needed help getting something started, I helped. I had spent years making sure his mistakes stayed small enough that he rarely had to feel them. That night, I stopped wondering whether Sabrina had kissed him or slept with him. I already knew enough about what Colin was choosing. Even if I could not prove every detail, what mattered now was understanding where my responsibility ended. The next morning, I began making calls and asking what could be separated legally when each obligation came up for renewal. I did not empty accounts or cancel anything that belonged to Colin. I did not interfere with his work or contact Sabrina. I moved my personal expenses away from the accounts I managed for both of us and made notes about the commitments I would not renew. For once, I was not planning his consequences. I was simply removing myself from them. A few days later, Patricia called me. She admitted Colin had told the family I never gave him room to breathe and that living with me felt like being managed. Instead, I told her, he's allowed to tell his version. I'm just done living inside it. Colin became less careful around Sabrina after that. Her name appeared more often, and he stopped explaining his evenings away unless I asked, which I no longer did. Then one night he sat across from me at the kitchen table and said he wanted a trial separation. I listened without interrupting. Before I could answer, he pulled another document from his bag. The financial commitment connected to his side venture was coming up for renewal, and he needed my signature to extend it for another year. He said we could deal with our marriage separately because this was business. I looked from the separation papers to the signature line and understood what Colin wanted. He wanted the freedom to leave the marriage while keeping the safety I had built underneath him. Colin left the papers on the kitchen table as if they belonged together. One said he needed distance from our marriage, while the other asked me to stay financially tied to his decision. I read the renewal page twice, then looked at him. So you want me out of your life? But still underneath it holding everything up? His jaw tightened. He said I was mixing two separate issues because I was angry about Sabrina. The side venture was business. Our marriage was personal, and he expected me to understand the difference. I told him I understood perfectly. He wanted independence only where independence felt good. I pushed the renewal document back and said I would not sign it. Colin stared at me as if he had expected resistance, but not a real refusal. Then his voice changed. Without my signature, he said he could lose his deposit and would have to scale back his plans. I told him, then you should make the decision you can afford. He stood and accused me of punishing him because I was jealous. I reminded him that I had not contacted Sabrina, interfered with his work, or taken anything from him. I was simply refusing another year of financial responsibility for a man asking to separate from me. Colin said this proved why he needed space. According to him, I turned everything into responsibility and consequences when people sometimes needed room to live. I understood how convenient that argument had become. This isn't about Sabrina, I said. She didn't make vows to me. You did. Colin said nothing at all. Then he folded his arms and told me that if I could not accept who he was now, maybe we should stop pretending and get divorced. He delivered it like an ultimatum and waited for me to panic. I could see the expectation on his face. Instead, I said, all right. His expression changed so quickly that I almost missed it. He asked, that's all you have to say after 11 years? I told him I had been saying things for a year. I had asked him to come home, tell me the truth, and show up when I needed him. He ignored every answer until mine stopped benefiting him. Colin looked down at the unsigned papers between us. For the first time, the freedom he wanted seemed to frighten him. The separation did not explode our lives overnight. Colin packed 2 suitcases and moved into an apartment across town, saying he needed a place that felt like his own. Sabrina stopped being a name he avoided mentioning and became someone he openly spent time with. I expected that change to hurt more than it did. The first consequence was smaller. Without my signature, Colin could not renew the financial commitment for his side venture on the terms he planned. He had to scale back, lose part of his deposit, and work with what he could afford himself. He called to tell me I had made everything harder, and I reminded him I had taken nothing away. Other problems followed quietly. Colin had to manage his own insurance, subscriptions, payments, appointments, and deadlines I had handled for years without announcing them. None of those things ruined him. They simply stopped disappearing before he noticed them. For the first time, his freedom included the boring parts of being responsible for himself. Sabrina was around more often at first, according to what Colin told his parents. But the version of him she knew at events came with music, drinks, hotel bars, and other people handling practical problems. Apartment life came with rent, laundry, canceled plans, and mornings after the party ended. The excitement Colin had chased was starting to look like ordinary life. Meanwhile, I returned to work gradually and started physical therapy for my shoulder and wrist. I stopped trying to make every unfinished task disappear before anyone noticed it. Some evenings, I left dishes in the sink and went to bed, and nothing terrible happened. A few weeks later, Douglas asked me to meet him for coffee. He looked tired, but he did not ask me to forgive Colin or reconsider the divorce. He stirred his coffee and said, he spent years confusing being taken care of with being trapped. I knew exactly what he meant. What surprised me was realizing I had helped create that pattern. Every time Colin faced discomfort, I stepped in because fixing things felt like love. Now I understood that protecting someone from every consequence could become another way of carrying his life. I was finally putting that weight down. Then, One evening, Colin called. His voice was quieter than I remembered. He said, "I think I made a mistake." I did not answer right away. I waited 2 days before agreeing to meet Colin. We chose a quiet coffee shop because there were still practical details to settle before the divorce could move forward. When he walked in, he looked tired, but not destroyed. I did not need him ruined to know I was right to leave. Colin sat across from me and wrapped both hands around his coffee. He told me Sabrina was gone. Once they were sharing ordinary days instead of stolen evenings. Whatever they had imagined together did not survive. I listened, but I did not feel the satisfaction I once thought that news would bring. Her leaving did not give me anything back that I had lost. Then Colin said he owed me the truth about the night of my accident. My body went still even though I had stopped waiting for that explanation weeks earlier. He admitted he had seen my message. Sabrina had been sitting beside him when it arrived. He knew I was going to the hospital, and he knew he should leave. But getting up would have meant admitting to Sabrina that his marriage still mattered. So he stayed where he was and told himself Douglas and Patricia would take care of me. By the time he called, he already knew there was no explanation that made his choice acceptable. For months, I had imagined that answer in 100 different ways. Hearing the truth was worse in one sense because there was no misunderstanding left to blame. I felt calmer than expected. The question that had once kept me awake no longer had any power to change my decision. Colin apologized without defending himself. Then he asked if there was any chance we could start over. Slowly, with counseling and different rules. I told him I believed he was sorry. I just don't believe being sorry rebuilds what you chose to leave broken. His eyes dropped to the table. We finished discussing the remaining divorce details without raising our voices. And when we stood, Colin asked if he could call me sometime. I told him it would be better if he did not. Then I walked outside first, carrying the answer I once thought I needed and realizing I no longer needed it at all. The divorce was final a few months later, and life became quieter than I expected. At work, I was promoted to regional operations lead, something I might have celebrated differently before. This time, I understood why it mattered. I finally had energy for a life I was actually living instead of constantly managing someone else's. I also decided to sell the house. For years, I had treated it as proof of everything I had built, and part of me wanted to keep it simply because Colin had once taken it for granted. Then I realized that would still make my decision about him. I chose a smaller townhouse closer to work, with more sunlight and fewer rooms demanding my attention. Patricia continued calling occasionally, and I was grateful our relationship did not disappear with my marriage. My physical therapy ended around the same time, and Owen asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime. I smiled and said yes. For once, I did not need to know where something was going before allowing myself to enjoy it. On my first night in the townhouse, I noticed one unopened moving box beside the kitchen wall. The old version of me would have unpacked it before going to bed because unfinished things made me restless. Instead, I turned off the kitchen light and left it there. Nothing fell apart because I stopped fixing everything. That was the lesson I carried out of my marriage. Peace was never about keeping every person, bill, plan, and problem under control. It was knowing what belonged to me and what I could finally put down. I did not lose the life I had spent years building. I simply stopped building it for two people. If you have ever realized you were carrying a relationship almost by yourself, tell me what finally made you see it. Like, share, and subscribe if this story stayed with you. Sometimes walking away is not giving up. Sometimes it is the first decision that finally belongs to you.